Today we're talking about the risky impact Trump's policies are having on the fashion industry, the greenwashing complaints that have been brought against one of the industry's biggest sustainability events, the ethics of a new sustainability buzzword, of course a Shein update, and so much more, including a whole section at the end of the video on some much needed good news both in and out of the fashion industry. As always, there's so much for us to cover, so let's just get into it. Before we do, welcome back to my channel. My name's Katie. I talk about sustainable fashion, online culture, and a whole lot of topics around that. So if that sounds good to you, then make sure you're subscribed to the channel, you're following me on my social media, but especially on my Instagram, where I do polls and call out questions so you can get involved in these videos. And with that, let's get into it. Starting with this headline I saw a couple of days ago that I just had to include on this video, because if you've watched any of my videos before, you'll know how much I hate an empty buzzword that gets thrown around when it comes to sustainability. And clean fashion is the newest one that we need to unpack. I did a whole video talking about clean beauty and the buzzwords that get used both in the beauty and fashion industry. And to now have the term clean fashion trending when the industry is well aware of consumers' distrust around these empty buzzwords is quite annoying. However, despite my dislike for the term, the idea behind clean fashion is one I could get behind, as long as brands are actually delivering on the promises that the buzzword seems to give. So, okay, what does clean fashion mean? According to Business of Fashion, a new wave of brands are trying to tap into a gap in the market by selling skin-friendly and chemical-free clothing. Boosted by the recent buzz around how bad synthetics are to our skin and a lot of regulatory crackdowns in Europe and the USA on so-called forever chemicals or PFAs that have been linked to worrying health links like reproductive issues and cancer. There's definitely been a growing movement of consumers on social media talking about how they're moving away from polyester in their wardrobes and wanting to move to natural-based fibers instead. But there's also been some frustration on how hard it is to find brands that are trying to market this. And I think that's where clean fashion is really having a moment. Just to be clear, this isn't a new conversation. Fashion journalist Alden Wicker has been trying to talk to people about the impacts of synthetics on their health for a while now. The lack of progress we've seen from the fashion industry on this is not due to information or consumer interest, in my opinion. It's understanding and lack of action from the fashion industry. Some brands are taking this opportunity to carve a niche for themselves in this clean fashion space, like Spanish manufacturer Pyretex, who uses a range of textiles in their collections from regenerative cotton to seaweed-based materials, which they're calling super textiles akin to superfoods in the beauty and wellness space. But for most of the fashion industry, this isn't really a pressing issue outside of the new regulation coming in. I did a video a little while ago talking about the concept of a nutrition label for our clothing, which could mention, amongst other things, the amount of synthetic dyes and chemicals used to make the clothes we're wearing. And a lot of you are really interested in this becoming an industry standard. And certainly this idea might be useful if more of us are looking to avoid synthetics in our wardrobes. But for all of the reasons I went into in that video, the majority of the fashion industry isn't willing or isn't even able to provide this information to consumers. Hence, I think the buzz around the fashion brands that are trying to be more transparent and are including information about what synthetic chemicals they use or are prioritizing natural materials. One thing I think was really interesting that was thrown up in this Business of Fashion article is the idea that this consumer interest in clean fashion could be a driving force to get more people shopping sustainably, or at least move them away from the fast fashion polyester collections. One designer within the clean fashion movement told BOF that the clean fashion movement could be seen as a selfish reason for consumers to change their shopping habits in the name of their own health, but would also have a bonus effect of being better for our planet at the same time. I'd be curious to hear your guys' thoughts on clean fashion, whether you think it's actually a good movement or whether you think it's empty buzzword marketing. So let me know in the comments. And with that, let's move on to one of the most important stories we're going to talk about today, which is that Trump's policies are affecting overseas garment workers. And it's looking like the situation is only going to get worse. The news came last week that the Trump administration had decided to shut down down USAID, signaling a major shift in US foreign aid policy. This situation has only worsened from when it started to decline at the beginning of the year, when Trump signed an executive order temporarily freezing foreign aid for 90 days, which has already had devastating impacts in the few months it's been in place. For fashion specifically, the effect was leaving vulnerable garment workers in an even more vulnerable position, especially those who rely on the charities for workplace empowerment and humanitarian relief efforts. Trump's more permanent policies that he announced last week will only see the system collapse further than it already has. Without the efforts of nonprofits and grassroots organizations, underpaid garment workers are at risk of starvation and destitution, not to mention workplace exploitation. A lot of charity work in these areas is spent holding brands accountable for their involvement or complicity in labor rights violations. And without them, we risk fashion being left to its own devices and not being held accountable at all for its transgressions. Charities like Labour Behind the Label, a non-profit which has been behind many wins in labour rights for garment workers, are crucial to a fair and just fashion industry. Experts are warning that, rather than improving America's situation as Trump so clearly wants, removing funding for these organisations will make it easier for them to exploit workers and further cheapen their labour, putting Trump's idea of a made in America fashion industry at a competitive disadvantage. Like I covered in Substack, the pushback for Trump's policies are being felt worldwide, with many people in other countries boycotting American-made products and shopping from local businesses instead. As Labour Behind the Label put it, at the root of the issues we face globally is a lack of active global connection, where people are being fed misinformation which encourages small world thinking. In this environment, it's more important than ever that we build solidarity and links across borders between workers and consumers to push back against exploitation. And if you're able and want to donate to Labour Behind the Label's important work, I'm going to put a link in the description for you to do so. But of course, if you want to support another charity of your choosing, then now's probably the time to do it, because I'm sure they'd love all the help they can get. Okay, next, a much needed, much requested Shein update. As always, they've got up to a lot in the last month and a half since I did a video, so let's just roll through it real quick. The first news is that profits declined by almost 40% in 2024, although their annual sales actually jumped up by almost 20%, and reports coming in suggest they still have a really strong grip on the apparel market. They had a much lower than predicted amount of profit in 2024, which is a big issue for the company hoping for a big IPO valuation. Shein also revealed the news it found 2 cases of child labor exploitation in its supply chains in 2024, the same amount as in 2023, implying poor progress improving their human rights in their supply chains, which you might remember was a topic they were particularly prickly on when they went to that UK parliamentary hearing. In my opinion, it's not looking quite so good for the company as it once was, which is obviously great news. In the past few years, they've had to deal with more and more rivals, threats of regulation and the closing of tax loopholes, and maybe most importantly, a growing public dislike. This last point is what they seem to be most concerned about, and they've spent a lot of time and money trying to reform their public image, which was very evident in their latest press release. Unfortunately for them, and fortunately for us, I don't think it had the intended effect. In this press release, Shein tried to boast about the factories they're renovating, including images of factories that looked, if possible, even more airbrushed than the one they showed in that infamous influencer trip a few years ago. The in-factory dormitory they showed was a particularly loud alarm bell for me, but also the way they were showing off empty canteens and empty factories, which, although they look nice, will do little to address and improve the issues garment workers are facing in their supply chains: exploitation, wage theft, and ungodly overtime hours. In fact, the section they put in the press release about providing free after-school care for garment workers was meant to show investment in the workers' lives, but actually just had experts questioning whether this was a way for garment workers to stay late into the night without having to worry about their children. As a journalist from Public Eye commented on the press release, it's also quite telling that while they boast in detail about every square meter renovated at a supplier, they still steadfastly refuse to disclose their authorized supplier list. Credibility and secrecy don't go together, and this lack of transparency makes it impossible to independently verify their claims of improvement. Shein's big move for this press release was announcing that they're pledging to spend $70 million over the next few years to improve their supply chains. But when your yearly profits are over $1 billion, that's billion with a B, and you're hunting for an IPO valuation in the multi-billions, that's literally just a drop in the bucket of your profits. Like I said, I don't think it's going well for the company, and I think the suggested drop in their IPO valuation is a very good indicator of this. But as I've been saying for about 2 years now, we're still going to have to wait and see whether they do actually list or not. But okay, before we get into some big news for the sustainable fashion industry, now feels like a really good time to remind you guys to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It takes 2 seconds, but it means a lot for me, and it means I can continue to make these videos. So I'd really appreciate that. And with that, let's get into the Copenhagen greenwashing complaint drama. So one of the biggest headlines over the past month was that Copenhagen Fashion Week, dubbed the most sustainable fashion week in the industry by many, has been accused of greenwashing. First, let's go into the complaint, which is mostly being leveled at the sustainability requirements that Copenhagen Fashion Week have in place for all brands trying to participate. These set minimum standards across 6 areas, including materials, workers' conditions, consumer engagement, and show production for all of the brands participating, and for which Copenhagen has been praised above all other fashion weeks for implementing. The greenwashing complaint, however, is that these sustainability requirements lack enforcement, allow vague sustainability claims, and fail to address major environmental issues like a brand's overproduction and collection frequency. A quote from anti-greenwashing expert Tanya Gotthardsson, I hope I'm saying that right, who co-filed for this complaint, explained that there's supposedly a screening committee, but when I looked into brands that have been approved, I found violations of Danish greenwashing laws almost immediately. She allegedly identified 7 brands with misleading sustainability claims, including vague language around organic cotton's impact and the labeling of synthetic materials as green. She said that these transgressions made her question whether any of the requirements were being forced at all. And in the wake of her calling this out, some brands have come forward to publicly admit that they know they're not quite within the requirements and that they're trying to fix it. But the real interest has been how the Fashion Week organisers themselves will respond, since the blame is being laid at their door rather than individually with the brands. And their response has fueled the drama even further. The CEO of Copenhagen Fashion Week pushed back against the allegations and responded that she can categorically reject the idea that Copenhagen Fashion Week is engaging in greenwashing, but also that the organisation does not market their sustainability requirements as guarantees. Her argument was that they had never marketed Copenhagen Fashion Week as the most sustainable fashion week, and that they cannot control how the media chooses to describe their sustainability efforts. But to that, Gotthardsson argued Copenhagen Fashion Forum, a media platform that operates under the same business registration as Copenhagen Fashion Week, has promoted these requirements extensively and effectively use them as a marketing tool. She said that despite the fact they're trying to now distance themselves from this, the sustainability requirements for Copenhagen have been used as a promotional asset for years. Currently, this greenwashing complaint is being reviewed, so I guess we'll have to wait and see the results. But it's definitely sent shockwaves in the industry, and it's very interesting to think how it's going to play out. And finally, before we move on to the good news section, let's quickly talk about how the attitude behavior gap in sustainability purchasing has been confirmed again. New data survey from Blue Yonder has shown that whilst many consumers say that sustainability matters to them in purchasing, only 26% of people prioritize it when it comes to apparel and footwear purchases. Diving deeper into this report quickly, the results show that our attitude towards sustainability remains positive. In fact, 78% of consumers say that sustainability considerations are somewhat or very important to them when choosing a product or shop to buy from. And notably, these numbers are higher in younger generations and in European countries, but they're pretty notable across the board. The problem, as always, is implementing this interest. And there's 2 main barriers for this that have cropped up in the research: trust and price. The latter remains a key barrier. Just 14% of us are willing to spend 10 or 20% more on a product if it's sustainable. The former, trust in sustainability products, is a rising challenge, with only 1 in 5 consumers believing brand sustainability claims in adverts. I wanted to include this research because it does point to a growing interest in sustainability, but also rising skepticism in whether any product is sustainable. And I think that's very reflective of the comments I get on here and the conversations I have with you guys. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we can fix this. But okay, with that, let's get on to the good news section of the video, which is always so important because it's not all doom and gloom and there are exciting things happening. And speaking of that attitude behavior gap, one thing I saw recently has highlighted a potential way to get more people putting their money where their mouth is, making sustainability more fun. This cool campaign by Tinder, which encouraged people to have items from previous relationships upcycled into something completely new, or maybe just something that didn't remind them so much of their ex, has had a lot of buzz online. The concept was inspired by the research that 2/3 of Americans are still holding on to something from a past relationship. And not only does this feel like a really fun way to get those items out of the back of your wardrobe and into your current rotation, but I think creative, engaging campaigns like this are a great way to get people involved in sustainability without even realizing it. Another thing I wanted to show that isn't really news, but I thought was super cool, is this creator's work that I showed in a recent video talking about the relationship between food and fashion recently. I think not only is it really satisfying to look at, there's also something to be said watching the time and dedication that goes into making these garments, and how we don't really think enough about the time and dedication that goes into making our clothes and the processes that might be going on behind the scenes. And I don't know, I just thought it was a really cool concept, but also got me thinking a little bit more, and I wanted to share it. But on to some amazing news in sustainable fashion, which is the pile of waste clothing in the Atacama desert may soon be sold off. If you don't know what I'm talking about, it's estimated that 39,000 tons of clothing is dumped in the Atacama desert region every year, most of it coming from the US, Europe, and Asia. And that clothing just sits in landfill and rots, or sometimes even burns, and creates a lot of issues for the locals there. But thanks to a new collaboration between Fashion Revolution Brazil, Vitex, and Desertio Vestidio, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, some of that clothing is going to find a new home. The clothing has first been cleaned and patched up in case it has any holes or stains, and then it was listed on a website where people could buy it for free and just pay for shipping. And the first collection sold out within hours, with the clothes being shipped to over 10 countries worldwide. Like I said, they sold out really quickly, but you can sign up to their mailing list so that you're notified when the next drop happens, and maybe have a part in rehoming these clothes and doing something good for the planet. And finally, to finish off the video, here's some good news and thoughts of things happening outside of the fashion industry. Like the news that the UK is getting a new national forest. Because as I say with every positive news section for these kind of videos, it's really important we take a step back and see where the progress is happening so we don't get too despondent and give up hope. But yeah, that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed watching. I'd love to hear any and all of your thoughts on any and all of the topics I've covered today. So leave those below. I'll be linking everything I mentioned. If you want to watch another video, then the one on screen right now is the one YouTube thinks you'll like the best. But if not, have a lovely day and I'll speak to you really soon. Bye.